Do you want to give everyone a quick introduction to yourself?
Morning, Chris. Thanks for having me. So back in the Stone Age, in 1980, I had the opportunity to join a startup and spent 3 years there, and that startup went public. And so I had a win on my first startup, and I said, this was a lot of fun, and I'm going to do this again because look how easy it is. Just work for 3 years, and you work hard for 3 years, but then you make all this money. And I have predominantly spent the rest of my 48-year career at startups disproving that theory. It ain't as easy as you think. But I will say that in the 20 plus startups I've had over that time frame, I have had great fun. I have great stories, and I have learned a thing or two, I think, on how to do and not do startups, especially in the early stage, which is much of what I've done. And so hopefully I have a word of wisdom so that you can avoid any of the pitfalls that I mistakenly went through.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, fantastic experience to tap into today. So there's a lot more first-time entrepreneurs, founders currently in the market for obvious reasons. What would be the main pieces of advice that you'd pass on to people in that position?
Okay, so the world has changed quite a bit. I just as a side note, I started my own first startup, or tried to, in 1985, I think it was. And in those days, you didn't build anything up front. You had a deck and a business model, and you went to venture capitalists. There were no such things as angels in those days. And you presented and said what you were going to build, and then they gave you the money to build it. So obviously it's changed, right? Because nowadays, it's, first off, the price of entry has come down so significantly than it used to be that people are basically building on the cuff and then getting customers and then going. And so the model is different, but I've been through both. So things I would suggest would be, I think the primary thing I would tell founders is that to keep in mind that you're building a business, not a product. And by this, I mean that I find that many early stage founders have thought so long and so hard about their product that becomes the focus of what they're doing. And that's a mistake. They have these images of what a great product will be and what each screen will look like and how people are going to love it, that then when they actually have the opportunity to start, that's what they focus on. And that's not what a CEO or a founder should be focusing on. What a founder needs to be focusing on is building a business that's sustainable and getting early sales and getting funding. And that's a sales job that is admittedly much harder than a product job, which is focusing on product, which I think is part of the reason why founders tend to focus on product. But as hard as it is to go ask to beg for money or beg for a sale, let's face it, that's kind of what you're doing. That's what you have to do to have a successful company. And so that's where you should be focusing on. To me, that is the biggest piece of advice I have for founders. The other thing is, as you keep driving early stage, you want to drive to get a small product out as soon as possible, get it proved in the market. You learn much more in the market than you will by sitting there cogitating on your own. and you want to drive to get some kind of sales. You want to prove that people will pay some amount of money for this. It doesn't have to be a lot to start. It doesn't have to be your full price that you got in your business model, but you got to prove that people are willing to pay for it. Giving it away is not going to impress anybody with money. You actually have to prove that it's sellable. So that's the second piece of advice.
Yep, brilliant. Thanks for that. And I've had a few conversations recently with founders who are they're ultimately looking for a co-founder to join them on the project. So typically you'd normally be a situation where you've got somebody who's going to lead the business side and they're looking for somebody on the tech side of the house, or vice versa. So in terms of people that are in that position and they're looking to find a co-founder, what advice would you pass on to people in that boat?
That's a great question, and it's actually an interesting one, because with the advent over the past just 2 years of LLMs, even that model has changed. I've been seeing a lot of companies, and there are cases where, given the, I'll say, somewhat simplicity of the software required for whatever the business is, because software isn't always the forefront, and the product may be different. There are some founders that I have suggested to that they use one of the no-code tools combined with using an LLM to build the first version of the product themselves.
Yep.
So they can save themselves quite a bit of money by not having to hire a dev team and not having to hire a CTO, or a product person to build it. They may want a designer to help them build so it looks nice, but they don't have to go that route. Now, for the, let's say, 70%, 75% of the founders out there whose product is too complex for that model, I would first off suggest that they hire not a full-time CTO, but look for a fractional CTO. The reason being that with a fractional CTO, they can pay less money, give away zero equity typically, or a little bit of equity. And if they can afford to step up in the experience level of the CTO they get, because they're not paying a full-time salary. And you're going to find that somebody's going to make less mistakes that way than having a more junior person who maybe hasn't done it as often or even once. The other thing I would say is, when looking at a team, there's going to be some part of your software that is the core technology, whether that's AI or some kind of computer vision or a device or some piece that's core, that you would probably want to invest money in hiring an engineer full-time. And the rest of it, the incidental infrastructure, a database, a UI, all the stuff, the kind of nuts and bolts, probably would want to outsource that. So focus on keeping the intellectual property in-house, and the rest that anybody can do, I would hire outsourced engineers. Simply because, again, the cost is cheaper, for better or for worse.
Yeah, brilliant. And with the increasing number of startups, candidates, that are looking for their next role are going to have lots of options available. So, what advice would you give to engineers or go-to-market people that are looking specifically to join a startup, in terms of making sure that they identify a good horse to back?
Whether it's a good horse to back or not, keep in mind that even I, who has some experience in trying to identify those, only have a hit rate of the standard hit rate is 1 out of 11 succeed, right? And success is typically defined as a pretty low bar. The investors get back their investment. But I think that, to me, I've done startups because I like doing them. It's fun, right? I'm well past retirement age now, and I'm still doing it because you meet interesting people, you meet smart people. I think that, no offense to anybody in large companies, but I just find a different personality, one that's willing to take risks, one that typically has a very open mind in startups than I do in large corporations. And I spent some time in large corporations over those years. And my brother was a large corporation guy in tech. My son is a large corporation guy in tech. Those guys didn't get, the same interest that I had in doing this. It's kind of an adrenaline rush. So go into a startup, whether it succeeds or fails, I would say, not because that you think you're going to make $1 million and be another Zuck, but because that happens extremely rarely, but because it's fun, right? And if you're of the mindset that going to a job every day, 9 to 5, is boring or is deadly in some sense, try a startup, because it ain't that, for sure. Right? It's not 9 to 5 for one, and secondly, it's an adrenaline rush, as I said.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do. As to finding one, go to every major city now, and a lot of mid-sized cities have meetups of some variety or another for matching founders with tech people. So go to a couple of those, start to meet people.
Brilliant. And in terms of people that are going to start trying to convince investors or start going to market and trying to bring in paid clients, etc., what advice would you kind of pass on to people that are in either of those situations, or potentially both?
Well, understand, especially with investment, it's a long and difficult road, right? It's about trying to convince people to to risk money on you, right? And so ultimately, the decision is not totally objective, in the sense that they look at the numbers and they make a decision based on that. It's also about feel. So understand that when you get rejected, which is going to happen a lot, it's not about you. Okay? It really isn't about you. I have definitely seen cases where I've gotten turned down, probably because the VC guy was having a bad day, right? So it can literally be totally out of your control. So you have to keep grinding at it. A small piece of advice about the deck is, keep in mind you want to tell a story, right? And I advise founders that they want to go from basically the general to the specific. Up front, you want to state your problem. Then you want to talk about the market size that has that problem. And that's TAM, SAM, SOM, of course. You want to then talk about how you're solving the problem, go a little bit into the product, show a business model that shows how much money you're going to make from doing the product. And then the rest is kind of incidental. I mean, you'll talk about what's the competitive market look like, who your people are, etc. And then the last slide, and I find this founders forget, don't forget the ask at the end. Put it down, right? Write down what you're looking for investment, how the investment structure is. You typically safe nowadays at 20. And so that's kind of, make sure you're telling that story all the way through. So.
Yeah, my mother always said, if you don't ask, you don't get. So
that's right.
So there we go.
She's absolutely right. Smart mother, Chris.
Brilliant. So moving on, we're trying to promote the startup ecosystem in Boston specifically. So advantages stroke frustrations do you see when it comes to people that are building in Boston versus obviously the Bay or New York?
Um, Interestingly, there is a book out there about this. That's a history of Boston startup community versus the Valley startup community. And it was actually very interesting. And the culture in the two places is extremely different. And that culture comes from the history of the two places. So in the Valley, there was a tradition that extended back to the start of Hewlett Packard and after World War II of what they kind of call either co-opetition or compoation or whatever, where HP and the more modern banking system there was more tuned to helping each other out. And the banking system there came originally out of the startup community. So the guys who made it in the first wave there was, HP, then Fairchild, etc., who were then turning their money over to help in the spirit of cooperation and competition, were much more tuned to risk in that market. The banking system in Boston, which is much older and goes back, if you think about it, entrepreneurial banking actually goes back to the China trade, right, which was the startup of the day in the mid-1840s in Boston. That banking system was much older, much more staid, and much more risk averse. And so as a result, the early startup investors in Boston, and that would be like Raytheon as a startup in probably the mid 50s, that community was facing an institutional banking system that didn't exist in California, where it came out of our own ecosystem. And therefore, our banking tends to be a much more risk averse and conservative here. Okay. Now, all of that said, and that's why there is some migration that happens from here to the West Coast, because it's easier to get funded out there. That said, we're still, last I looked, the second largest startup ecosystem in the country, if not the world. And it's still a great place to do startups because of that ecosystem. The banking obviously has evolved even from my day when it was just large VC, and there were only a few of them then, as I remember, to an entire ecosystem of angels and high net worth individuals to, various levels of investment banking that do everything from startups to Series X. And I've obviously been out to the Valley. I actually had one of my startups that was successful originated out there. I was the only person on the East Coast. But I still have spent most of my career and life here in Boston, and have successfully and unsuccessfully started numerous companies, all of which have gotten funded here. So I happen to personally like it here more. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really insightful. What do you think is the best piece of advice you've ever received from another founder?
I did a startup. I joined a startup. It wasn't mine. In the 2000s, I think it was. It was in a very high-tech startup. It was a hardware-software jointly startup called Virtual Machine Works. It was started by Anant Agarwal, who is a professor of electrical engineering over at MIT. He later became head of their, what was it called, X? What was the name of their online education system where they were offering courses? Nant's a great guy. He had not recognized that it was his first startup, and it was pretty complex because it was hardware and software in a field that's pretty high tech. It was for chip design. So he brought in an experienced startup guy who had started numerous companies, kind of well-known guy named Alan Michaels, Michels. You can look him up. And Alan once told me something that was important. He said and he's made a lot of money off of startups over the years. And he said that the way I do it is that I get out early and I get out often. And by that, he meant that he doesn't try and keep a company around for a long time in the hopes of making a lot of money on a sale as he expands the company. Because the risk, the longer you hold on to a company before a liquidity event, the risk is something goes wrong that you can't control, right? I had a startup that was doing really well in the radio industry. We were doing great. We had 500 radio stations assigned to us, and then 2008 happened, and we had no control of, something we didn't have any control of, and company didn't tank, but it's now a lifestyle business for my partner. Shout out to Jeff. And so Alan always suggested that take less money and go and do another one, right? And that's a safer path, and one that I have tried to adhere to throughout my career. So I'm willing to sell for in the teens, make some money back. It's not a big 7-figure or even a 6-figure. I've had a couple of very low 6 figures, but most of mine are tens of thousands out to me and to the other founders, and that's fine because I do it again.
Yep. Brilliant. It's painful you bringing up 2008 because at that point in time, Lehman Brothers were my best client. So
there you go.
I could understand.
Who knew, right?
Yeah, I could understand. Oh God, I've come out in a cold sweat just thinking about it.
Yeah, I hear you.
Oh man. So one final question then. So you're obviously very passionate about startups, working in the startup environments, etc. But you still ultimately need to navigate the high highs and the low lows. So how do you personally stay sane, motivated when it comes to dealing with those?
Other than 2008, which was troublesome, and I have been through in startups a couple other. I mean, there was another one in 80. There was 90. There was 80, somewhere around 80 to 84. Those were all downturns in the industry. I can't say I've ever really had a problem with that, only in the sense, I mean, I've been unemployed, obviously. It happens because the markets will dry up. But to me, I stay sane because I love what I do, right? So, again, advice to any founders, it's really hard work, especially as a founder or even as an employee. You're working long hours. It's hard work. So make sure this is what you want to do. And don't do it because you think you're going to get rich. You very well may not. It can happen, but it can also not happen. So do it because you like doing it, because it gets you up in the morning and you like going to work.
Yep. Brilliant piece of advice to finish on there, Charlie. So listen, thanks very much for joining today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Chris. It's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some amazing advice there for people to kind of digest and unpack. So yeah, I appreciate you joining, and best of luck with the startups that you're currently involved in.
Thank you, Chris. Have a great day, man.
Yeah, you too.